The cathedral loomed over the small village, its dark spires piercing the clouded sky like skeletal fingers. For centuries, it had stood as a monument to a forgotten time, its grand arches and stained glass windows long since faded into shadows. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning travelers and the curious alike to stay away from its hallowed grounds after dusk. But the warnings only served to pique the interest of the 5 explorers who now stood at its entrance, lanterns in hand. Dr. Elias Hargrove, the leader of the group, gazed up at the cathedral with a mix of awe and determination. A historian with a penchant for the occult, Hargrove had spent years researching the cathedral's crypt, driven by rumors of lost relics and buried secrets. Beside him stood Jonathan Pritchard, a skeptic and fellow academic, Sarah Whitaker, a local historian with knowledge of the cathedral's dark past, Peter Marsh, an archaeologist with a nose for hidden passages, and Emily Ward, a young journalist eager to document their discoveries. As they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the cathedral's interior greeted them with a musty chill. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows. The scent of ancient wood and stone filled their nostrils, mingling with the faint smell of incense, long forgotten. The group moved forward cautiously, their footsteps echoing eerily off the marble floors. "We're looking for the stairs leading to the crypt," Hargrove whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast silence. Sarah nodded, pointing toward a darkened alcove at the far end of the cathedral. There, behind the altar, that's where they would have hidden it. They approached the altar, a towering structure of cold stone adorned with carvings of saints and angels. But as they drew nearer, it was not the angels that caught their attention. No, it was the grotesque figures etched beneath them, twisted, horned beings with eyes that seemed to follow them as they moved. Sarah shivered as she brushed her fingers over the ancient stone, feeling the deep grooves of the carvings. "These aren't just saints," she murmured. "There's something wrong here." Peter, ever practical, pulled out a set of tools and began examining the floor around the altar. "Look for anything unusual, an uneven tile, a hidden lever." It was Emily who found it. Her sharp eyes caught the glint of a small, rusted ring embedded in the floor, partially concealed by dust and debris. She knelt down and tugged on it, and with a creak of ancient hinges, a section of the floor began to rise, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that disappeared into darkness. "Looks like this is it," Jonathan muttered, peering down into the abyss. The air that wafted up from below was stale, carrying with it the faintest hint of something rotten. Without a word, Hargrove lit his lantern and started down the stairs, the others following close behind. The steps were worn and uneven, forcing them to move slowly, each step taking them deeper into the earth. The walls of the staircase were lined with cold stone, damp to the touch, and the further they descended, the more oppressive the air became. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended, opening into a low, vaulted chamber. The explorers' lanterns cast long, flickering shadows across the crypt's walls, revealing rows of stone coffins stacked against the walls. The lids of many were ajar, as though the inhabitants had been disturbed or had left of their own accord. "We've found it," Hargrove whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of triumph and unease. "The crypt." The silence was thick, almost tangible, as the group spread out, their eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. There was a weight in the air, a presence that seemed to press down on them, making it hard to breathe. But it was not just the claustrophobic space that unnerved them, it was the sense that they were not alone. As Emily moved to examine one of the coffins, she noticed something strange. The stone lid was adorned with unfamiliar symbols, etched deeply into the surface. She brushed away the dust, revealing a series of interlocking patterns that seemed to twist and writhe in the lantern light. "These symbols," she called out to the others, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never seen anything like them." Hargrove moved to her side, his eyes narrowing as he studied the markings. "They're ancient, pre-Christian, maybe even older." Suddenly, a low, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the crypt. A whisper, soft and fleeting, like the rustle of dry leaves. The explorers froze, their hearts pounding in unison as they strained to listen. The whisper came again, closer this time, more distinct, though the words were unintelligible. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice was barely a breath, her eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could respond, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling the crypt with a cacophony of voices. The air grew colder, and the light from their lanterns began to flicker, casting the chamber into a strobe of shadow and light. Hargrove turned, his face pale. "We need to leave, now." But as they hurried toward the staircase, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the whispers rose to a fevered pitch, filling their ears with a maddening chorus. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows lengthened, reaching out like grasping hands. With a final, desperate push, they made it to the staircase, only to find the entrance blocked by a heavy stone slab that had slid into place, trapping them in the crypt. Emily's scream pierced the darkness as she turned to face the chamber, the sound of her terror echoing in the confined space. But even as her voice faded, the whispers continued, growing louder, more menacing. The explorers realized too late that they had crossed a threshold that should never have been breached. And now, the crypt's restless inhabitants were awake, their ancient curse unleashed upon the living. The cold stone walls of the crypt seemed to pulse with a life of their own, reverberating with the echoes of 1,000 tortured souls. The explorers stood frozen in place, their breath catching in their throats as the cacophony of whispers swirled around them. Each voice was distinct, yet together they formed a single malevolent entity that filled the chamber with a tangible sense of dread. Hargrove, always the leader, fought to keep his composure. "Stay close," he ordered, though his voice trembled. "We need to find another way out." Sarah nodded, but her eyes betrayed her fear as she clutched the straps of her satchel like a lifeline. Jonathan, ever the skeptic, tried to shake off the growing unease gnawing at his mind. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, even he could not deny the unnatural presence that surrounded them. Emily clung to her lantern, its light flickering weakly against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. She was a journalist by trade, accustomed to observing horrors from a distance, through the lens of a camera. But here, in the belly of the cathedral, the horror was all too real. Peter, ever the practical one, took a step toward one of the walls, running his hand along the damp stone, searching for any sign of a hidden passage or a weakness they could exploit. "There has to be a way out of here," he muttered, though the rising panic in his voice betrayed his doubts. But the crypt had no intention of letting them go. The whispers began to coalesce into words, ancient and unintelligible, but laden with a heavy, oppressive weight. The explorers exchanged nervous glances, the realization dawning on them that they were hearing not just voices, but the thoughts and memories of those who had been entombed here. "We shouldn't have come here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing din. "This place, it's cursed." "No," Hargrove replied, though even he was unsure. "It's just It's just the atmosphere. The mind plays tricks in the dark. We need to stay calm." But as if to contradict him, the air grew even colder, and the light from their lanterns dimmed further. The shadows that had once lingered at the edges of the chamber now seemed to move of their own accord, slithering along the floor like serpents, closing in around them. And then, the whispers changed. No longer a chaotic jumble of voices, they began to form a chant, low and rhythmic, each syllable dripping with malice. It was a prayer, or perhaps a curse, spoken in a language older than the cathedral itself. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The chant was inside her head, filling her mind with images of death and despair, of blood-soaked altars and sacrificial rites performed in the name of gods long forgotten. Peter stumbled backward, his back pressing against one of the stone coffins. The lid shifted slightly, and he recoiled as a skeletal hand slipped out, its fingers curled into a claw. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the hand was moving slowly, deliberately, as though trying to reach out to him. "Get away from it," Jonathan shouted, rushing to Peter's side and pulling him away from the coffin. But even as he did, he felt the icy fingers of dread close around his own heart. The crypt was alive, and it wanted them. Emily's lantern flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only Hargrove's lantern remained, its light barely enough to keep the shadows at bay. The explorers huddled together, the oppressive darkness pressing down on them from all sides. "We need to get out of here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to—" Her words were cut off as the chanting grew louder, filling the crypt with a deafening roar. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the ground beneath them trembled as if the cathedral itself was awakening from a long, dark slumber. And then, without warning, the chanting stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, the silence was absolute. The explorers stood in the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests, waiting for whatever horror was to come next. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the crypt, emanating from the walls themselves. The explorers shielded their eyes, but the light was so intense it seemed to burn through their eyelids, searing their minds with images of unspeakable terror. They saw the monks who had once lived in the cathedral, their faces twisted in agony as they were dragged into the crypt, their screams echoing through the stone walls. They saw the rituals that had been performed here, the blood that had been spilled, the lives that had been sacrificed in the name of dark, ancient gods. And they saw the spirits of the dead, awakened from their eternal slumber, their hollow eyes filled with rage and sorrow as they reached out to the living, desperate to escape the prison that had held them for centuries. The light faded as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the explorers once again in darkness. But the silence was broken, this time by a single, clear voice that echoed through the crypt. "Why have you disturbed us?" The voice was not human, but it was unmistakably alive, filled with centuries of suffering and despair. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding the explorers, suffocating them with its presence. Hargrove tried to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but his voice caught in his throat. The others were silent, too terrified to move or even breathe. "Why have you come here?" the voice demanded again, this time louder, more insistent. The shadows in the crypt began to shift, forming shapes, figures that seemed to move closer with every passing second. And then, from the darkness, the figures emerged, ghostly, translucent forms of the monks, their robes tattered and stained with blood, their faces contorted in eternal torment. They drifted toward the explorers, their hollow eyes locked onto the intruders who had dared to disturb their rest. One by one, the explorers backed away, retreating until they were pressed against the cold stone walls. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the spirits that now surrounded them, their cold, dead hands reaching out to claim them. The whispers had returned, but now they were filled with anger, with the rage of those who had been trapped for centuries, unable to find peace. The crypt seemed to close in around the explorers, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thinner, until it felt as though the very life was being squeezed out of them. And in that moment, as the spirits drew closer, the explorers understood the truth. They had awakened something ancient and terrible, something that had been buried deep within the crypt for a reason, and now there would be a price to pay for their trespass. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the spirits surged forward, their hands outstretched, ready to drag the living down into the darkness from which they would never escape. The spirits surged forward, their ghostly hands reaching for the living with a chilling desperation. In the midst of the chaos, Hargrove seized the lantern, swinging it wildly in an attempt to ward off the approaching apparitions. But the flickering light seemed powerless against the advancing shadows, which crept ever closer, drawn to the warmth of the living. "Back, all of you!" Hargrove shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He knew they were outnumbered, surrounded by the restless dead, but he couldn't let his team succumb to panic. Not yet. The explorers scrambled to stay together, the walls of the crypt pressing in on them as the shadows slithered across the floor, climbing up their legs like cold, grasping vines. The air grew heavy with a palpable malevolence, each breath feeling more labored than the last. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a loose stone. She cried out as she fell, her hands instinctively reaching out to break her fall, but they found only the cold, unforgiving stone of the crypt floor. The shadows surged around her, drawn to her vulnerability, and in an instant, she felt their icy touch on her skin. It was as though the warmth of life was being drained from her body, leaving only a hollow, freezing emptiness in its wake. "Help me!" Sarah's voice was barely more than a whisper, but the terror in it was unmistakable. Peter lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "We have to keep moving," he urged, his eyes darting around the chamber, searching for any sign of an escape. But the shadows seemed to have a life of their own, writhing and twisting as they formed a solid wall between the explorers and the crypt's entrance. Emily, trembling with fear, held up her camera, as if the lens might somehow capture the spirits and render them powerless. But the device was useless in the suffocating darkness, its flash swallowed by the overwhelming void that surrounded them. She lowered it, realizing with a sinking feeling that they were trapped, their escape cut off by the very darkness they had dared to enter. The crypt grew colder still, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Frost began to form on the stone walls, the breath of the living turning to mist in the frigid air. And with the cold came the overwhelming sense of despair, a deep, gnawing hopelessness that threatened to consume them all. The shadows that had once been intangible now took on a more solid form, coalescing into vague, nightmarish shapes, figures that resembled the monks they had seen in the visions. Their faces were obscured, their forms wreathed in darkness, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if savoring the terror that radiated from the intruders. "We have to find another way out," Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking as he fought to keep his composure. He pointed to the far end of the crypt, where the darkness seemed less oppressive. There must be another passage." Hargrove nodded, gripping his lantern tightly. "Go," he commanded. "I'll keep them at bay as long as I can." The group hesitated, unwilling to leave their leader behind, but the advancing shadows left them no choice. With a final, desperate glance at Hargrove, they bolted toward the distant corner of the crypt, where the shadows seemed less dense. Their footsteps echoed through the chamber, each one filled with the dread that something unseen might reach out and pull them into the darkness. Hargrove stood his ground, brandishing the lantern like a talisman against the encroaching spirits. The dim light flickered and wavered, casting grotesque shadows on the crypt walls, but the darkness around him was relentless, hungry. The spirits of the monks, their faces twisted in eternal torment, pressed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on the living intruder who dared defy them. "Get out of here!" Hargrove shouted over his shoulder. Though his voice was growing weaker, his confidence faltering. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the centuries-old curse pressing down on him like a physical force. The spirits seemed to whisper directly into his mind, filling it with images of their suffering, of the blasphemous rituals that had sealed their fate within these walls. Meanwhile, Jonathan, Sarah, Peter, and Emily reached the far end of the crypt, their hearts pounding in their chests. Peter frantically ran his hands along the cold stone, searching for any sign of a hidden passage, a loose stone, anything that might lead them to safety. But the wall felt solid, impenetrable, as though the cathedral itself had conspired to trap them within its cursed depths. "There has to be a way out," Peter muttered, more to himself than to the others. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one forming a small cloud of mist in the freezing air. There has to be. Emily, clutching her camera, could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, suffocating her with its ancient malevolence. She turned back toward Hargrove, who was still holding the lantern high, the light flickering more weakly with each passing moment. "We can't just leave him," she cried, her voice tinged with desperation. "We have to help him." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't help him if we're dead, Emily. We need to find a way out, now." Jonathan, though visibly shaken, tried to think logically through the panic. The monks must have had a way to move between the crypt and the cathedral. There has to be a secret passage or a tunnel leading out of here. As he spoke, his hands brushed over a section of the wall that felt different from the rest. Smoother, colder. He pressed harder, and to his shock, the stone shifted slightly under his touch. "Here," Jonathan called out, adrenaline surging through him. "I've found something." Peter joined him, and together they pushed against the stone, gritting their teeth with the effort. Slowly, with a grinding sound that echoed through the crypt, the stone began to move, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind it. The passage was dark and uninviting, but it was the only chance they had. "Come on," Jonathan urged, motioning for Sarah and Emily to follow. "This might be our way out." But before they could move, the ground beneath them shook violently, as if the very foundation of the cathedral was rebelling against their intrusion. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the walls of the crypt seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the shadows were alive and angered by their discovery. Hargrove, still holding the lantern, could feel the spirits closing in on him, their presence a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He knew he had little time left, that the light would soon fail, and with it, any chance of survival. With a final burst of determination, he turned and ran toward the passage, the shadows nipping at his heels. "Go, go, go!" Hargrove shouted, urging the others into the passage as he stumbled forward, the lantern flickering weakly in his grasp. The spirits screamed in fury, their wails echoing through the crypt like a banshee's cry. The darkness surged forward, and Hargrove could feel the icy grip of death closing around him. The others had just made it into the passage when the lantern finally gave out, plunging the crypt into complete darkness. Hargrove, his breath coming in ragged gasps, managed to push through the narrow opening, collapsing onto the cold stone floor of the passage just as the shadows reached the threshold. For a moment, it seemed as though the darkness would follow them, but the passage's narrow confines and the centuries-old barrier seemed to hold the spirits at bay, at least for now. The group huddled together in the darkness, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding with fear and relief. But as they lay there, catching their breath, the oppressive atmosphere of the crypt seemed to seep into the passage, the walls closing in on them, the shadows lurking just out of sight. The whispers returned, softer now but still menacing, echoing through the narrow corridor. "We're not safe yet," Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to keep moving." Without another word, they struggled to their feet, their legs weak with exhaustion and fear. The passage ahead was long and dark, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. But it was their only chance, and so they pressed on, the darkness at their backs, and the shadows creeping ever closer, waiting for their moment to strike. The narrow passage seemed to stretch on forever, a dark tunnel carved from ancient stone that pressed in on the explorers from all sides. The oppressive atmosphere of the crypt still clung to them, a suffocating presence that made every breath feel like a battle. Their lanterns were gone, and they moved through the darkness by touch alone, their fingers brushing against the cold, damp walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The whispers had grown quieter, but they were still there, a faint, insistent murmur that filled the silence. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, speaking in tongues long forgotten, recounting the horrors that had taken place in the cathedral above. The darkness was so complete that it felt almost tangible, like a heavy shroud that weighed them down with each step. Hargrove led the way, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, the chill that had seeped into his bones. The lantern had been their only source of light, and without it, the passage was nothing more than an endless abyss. But turning back was not an option. The spirits they had awakened were still behind them, their anger palpable, their whispers a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the dark. "Are we even going the right way?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear and exhaustion. She clutched her satchel to her chest as if it might somehow protect her from the malevolent forces that surrounded them. "We have no choice but to keep going," Jonathan replied, though his own voice was filled with uncertainty. "There has to be a way out. These tunnels wouldn't exist if there wasn't an escape route." Peter, ever the pragmatist, ran his hands along the walls as they moved, searching for any sign of a hidden door or a change in the texture of the stone. "If we keep our hands on the walls, we won't get lost," he said, more to reassure himself than the others. But even as he spoke, the tunnel began to widen, and the walls on either side fell away, leaving them in a cavernous space. The darkness was so complete that it was impossible to tell how large the chamber was, but the air felt different, staler, thicker, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. Emily stopped abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong here." As if in response to her words, the air grew colder, and a faint glow began to emanate from the far side of the chamber. The explorers turned toward the light, their eyes straining to see what lay ahead. The glow was faint, sickly, casting long, eerie shadows that flickered and danced across the walls. And then they saw them. Rows of stone coffins lined the chamber, their lids slightly ajar as though disturbed by unseen hands. The glow seemed to come from within the coffins themselves, a pale ghostly light that bathed the chamber in an otherworldly radiance. The explorers could see the shapes of the long-dead monks inside, their skeletal remains clothed in tattered robes, their empty eye sockets staring into the void. Sarah gasped, stepping back as she realized what they were seeing. These must be the monks, the ones who were cursed. Hargrove nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. The order that was sealed away, this must be their final resting place. But as they stood there, transfixed by the sight before them, the glow began to intensify, the light growing brighter and more menacing. The air around them seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous hum, and the coffins began to shift, the lids grinding against the stone as though something inside was trying to escape. Peter moved to the nearest coffin, his instincts as an archaeologist taking over. "These shouldn't be moving on their own," he muttered, his voice strained. "There's no logical explanation for this." But as he reached out to touch the coffin's lid, it suddenly burst open with a violent force, sending a shockwave of cold air through the chamber. Peter staggered back, his heart racing, as the skeletal remains inside began to stir. The bones creaked and cracked, the ancient joints moving as though animated by some dark, unseen power. The other coffins followed suit, their lids flying open one by one, the skeletal monks rising from their tombs. The glow that had once been faint now pulsed with an intense, unnatural light, casting grotesque shadows on the walls as the dead monks turned their hollow eyes toward the living intruders. Emily screamed, the sound piercing the cold air as she backed away, her hands trembling. They're alive!" "No," Hargrove whispered, his voice filled with dread. "They're not alive, but they're not at rest either. The monks' spirits, bound to their skeletal remains by the ancient curse, were now fully awakened. Their hollow eyes glowed with a pale, ghostly light, and their bony hands reached out toward the explorers, fingers curled like claws. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine as one of the monks locked its gaze on him, its skeletal mouth opening in a soundless scream. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, the fear in his voice undeniable. "Now!" But the monks were blocking their path, their skeletal forms moving with unnatural speed and agility, their robes billowing around them like shadows come to life. The explorers were trapped, surrounded by the undead monks who had been awakened from their centuries-long slumber, their anger and sorrow palpable in the cold air. Sarah grabbed Peter's arm, her voice frantic. "There has to be a way out. Look for another passage, anything." Hargrove, his heart pounding, tried to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. "We need to find whatever's binding them to this place," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "There must be something, an artifact, a relic, that's keeping them here. If we can destroy it, we might be able to put them to rest." But as the monks advanced, their bony fingers reaching out for the living, it became clear that there was little time to search. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and something far worse, something ancient and malevolent that clung to the walls like a miasma. Emily, still clutching her camera, felt a surge of desperation. She raised the device, snapping a photo of the monks as they approached. The flash lit up the chamber for a brief moment, revealing the full horror of the situation. The monks were not just spirits, but twisted, tortured souls bound to their earthly remains, their bodies warped by centuries of decay and the dark magic that had cursed them. But the flash seemed to have an unexpected effect. The light momentarily blinded the monks, causing them to recoil as though burned. Their hollow eyes flickered, the glow dimming for a brief second, before reigniting with renewed fury. "That's it," Hargrove shouted, realizing what had happened. "The light, it weakens them. We need more light." But in the dark, ancient crypt, Light was a precious commodity. The explorers had only their cameras and a few scattered matches to fend off the undead monks, and time was running out. "Over here!" Peter shouted, pointing to a narrow tunnel that led off from the main chamber. It was barely visible in the darkness, but it offered their only hope of escape. "This way!" The explorers didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the tunnel, the monks close behind, their bony fingers reaching out to grasp at the living. The air was filled with the sound of rattling bones and the low, haunting whispers of the monks, their curses and pleas echoing through the chamber. As they reached the tunnel, Hargrove turned back, his eyes meeting the hollow gaze of the nearest monk. For a brief moment, he saw something in those empty sockets. A flicker of humanity, a glimpse of the soul that had once inhabited the cursed remains. But there was no time for sympathy. The monks were relentless, their rage unquenchable, their suffering eternal. Hargrove turned and followed the others into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them as they ran, the whispers of the unrested souls fading into the distance as they fled deeper into the bowels of the cathedral. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until the explorers had to move single file, their hands brushing against the cold, damp stone as they stumbled forward. The air grew heavier, the sense of dread more palpable with each step. But the monks were behind them, their relentless pursuit a constant reminder that there was no going back. The only way out was forward, into the darkness, toward whatever horrors awaited them in the depths of the crypt. The tunnel seemed endless, a twisting, claustrophobic passage that wound ever deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness around the explorers became a living thing, pressing against their skin, whispering ancient secrets into their ears. They moved as quickly as they could, but exhaustion was beginning to take its toll, and the terror that clung to them like a shroud made every step feel like a battle. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "Hargrove, what do you think we're dealing with here? What kind of curse could do this?" Hargrove, who had been leading the group, slowed his pace as he considered her question. "It's something older than the cathedral itself," he said finally, his voice low. "The monks who were buried here were part of an order that dabbled in dark rites, rituals meant to summon and control powers beyond this world. But they went too far. They invoked something they couldn't control, and it turned on them." "Turned on them?" Jonathan echoed, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting the skeletal monks to appear at any moment. "What do you mean?" "They were cursed," Hargrove explained, his tone grim. "The rituals they performed bound their souls to their bodies, trapping them in a state between life and death. When the cathedral was built, the local church authorities learned of the blasphemous rites and sealed the monks away in the crypt, hoping to contain the curse. But it seems the curse was never truly broken. It's been lying dormant all this time, waiting for someone to disturb it." "And that someone was us," Peter muttered, his face pale. "So now what? We find the source of the curse and destroy it?" Hargrove nodded. "If we can find whatever it was that the monks used to bind themselves, an artifact, a relic, then we might be able to break the curse and put their souls to rest. But where do we even start?" Emily asked, her voice edged with desperation. "We're lost in these tunnels, and those things are still after us." As if in response to her words, the tunnel suddenly opened up into a vast underground chamber. The explorers paused at the entrance, their breath catching in their throats as they took in the sight before them. The chamber was enormous, its walls lined with ancient tapestries that had long since rotted away, leaving only faint, ghostly images of the monks and the dark rituals they had performed. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained with the dark, dried remnants of centuries-old blood. Surrounding the altar were dozens of stone statues, each one depicting a twisted, monstrous figure that seemed to watch the intruders with cold, lifeless eyes. And there, on the altar, was the source of the curse, a black, obsidian chalice, its surface etched with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with a sickly green light. The air around the chalice seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, a malevolent force that sent shivers down the explorers' spines. "That's it," Hargrove whispered, his eyes fixed on the chalice. "That's what's binding the monks to this place. The chalice was used in their rituals, and it's holding their souls captive." Peter took a cautious step forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the altar. "If we destroy it, the curse should be broken, right? The monks can finally be at peace." "In theory, yes," Hargrove replied, though his voice was filled with doubt. "But we have to be careful. The chalice is infused with dark magic. If we're not careful, we could unleash something even worse." Jonathan, always the skeptic, crossed his arms. "And how exactly do we destroy something like that? It's not like we have holy water or a priest on hand." Hargrove frowned, thinking. The chalice was created through a ritual. Maybe it can be unmade the same way. But we'd need to perform a counter-ritual, one that can sever the ties binding the souls to the chalice. "But we don't know the original ritual," Sarah pointed out, her voice tight with fear. "How can we possibly perform a counter-ritual?" Hargrove's eyes scanned the chamber, lingering on the faded tapestries that adorned the walls. "There might be something here," he said slowly. "The monks wouldn't have left their secrets unguarded. There could be clues hidden in the images on the walls, something that can guide us." Emily, ever the journalist, pulled out her camera and began snapping photos of the chamber, focusing on the tapestries. "We don't have much time," she reminded them, her voice urgent. "Those monks are still out there and they won't stop until we're dead." Peter and Sarah joined Hargrove in examining the tapestries, their eyes scanning the faded images for anything that resembled a ritual or incantation. The figures depicted were twisted and grotesque, their features distorted by age and decay. But there were patterns, symbols and gestures repeated across the different panels. "This one here," Peter said, pointing to a tapestry near the altar. "It shows the monks performing some kind of ritual with the chalice, but then there's another figure, a man in robes, holding a book. He's doing something different, like he's reversing what the monks are doing." Hargrove studied the image closely, nodding. "Yes, that could be it. A counter-ritual. We need to find the book." They spread out across the chamber, searching for any sign of the book depicted in the tapestry. Time was running out, the whispers in the tunnel behind them were growing louder, and the temperature in the chamber was steadily dropping. Finally, in a shadowed alcove near the back of the chamber, Sarah found it. The book was ancient, its leather cover cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the symbols on the cover matched those on the chalice, and when Hargrove opened it, he found the pages filled with strange, arcane text. "This is it," Hargrove said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "The counter-ritual. If we can perform it, we can break the curse." "But we can't read that," Jonathan said, peering over Hargrove's shoulder at the incomprehensible symbols. "How are we supposed to perform a ritual we don't understand?" Hargrove turned the book over in his hands, his mind racing. "It's written in an ancient script, but the symbols, the gestures, they're universal. We don't need to understand every word, just the basics. If we follow the instructions in the book, We should be able to reverse the ritual that created the chalice. But we'll have to be quick, Peter added, glancing nervously toward the tunnel. Those monks aren't going to give us much time. The group gathered around the altar, the book open in Hargrove's hands. The chalice pulsed with a dark energy, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter as if sensing the impending threat. Hargrove's hands trembled slightly as he began to read from the book, his voice low and steady. The words were strange, their meaning lost to time, but the power in them was undeniable. As Hargrove recited the incantation, the air in the chamber seemed to thrum with energy, a force that pushed against the darkness and began to unravel the curse that had held the monks captive for so long. But as the ritual progressed, the chamber began to shake, the walls groaning under the strain of the ancient magic. The statues around the altar seemed to come alive, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light, their stone mouths moving in silent mockery of the ritual. The chalice vibrated violently on the altar, the dark energy within it struggling to break free. The symbols on its surface twisted and writhed, as if trying to resist the power of the counter-ritual, and then, from the tunnel, the monks appeared. Their skeletal forms moved with a terrifying speed, their hollow eyes fixed on the chalice, their bony hands reaching out to stop the ritual that threatened to end their cursed existence. "We need to hold them off," Hargrove shouted, his voice rising above the din. "Keep them away from the altar until the ritual is complete." Jonathan and Peter moved to block the tunnel entrance, using whatever they could find to create a barrier between the monks and the altar. Emily, her camera still in hand, snapped another flash photo, the bright light momentarily blinding the advancing spirits. But the monks were relentless, their rage fueled by centuries of torment. They pushed against the makeshift barrier, their skeletal fingers clawing at the stone, their mouths open in silent screams of fury. Hargrove's voice grew louder, more insistent, as he neared the final words of the incantation. The chalice on the altar began to crack, dark energy seeping from the fissures in its surface, twisting and writhing like a living thing. The monks pushed harder, the barrier beginning to crumble under their relentless assault. Jonathan and Peter struggled to hold them back, but it was clear that they were outmatched, the undead monks driven by a force far greater than anything they had ever encountered. But just as the barrier was about to give way, Hargrove uttered the final words of the ritual. The chalice shattered with a deafening crack, the dark energy within it exploding outward in a blinding flash of light. The shockwave sent the monks flying backward, their skeletal forms disintegrating into dust as the curse that had bound them was finally broken. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the ancient curse was dispelled. The glow that had surrounded the altar faded, and the air grew warmer, the sense of dread that had haunted the explorers easing at last. Hargrove collapsed to his knees, the book falling from his hands. The others rushed to his side, their faces filled with relief and exhaustion. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Hargrove nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over. The curse. It's been lifted." The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just accomplished sinking in. They had broken the curse, freed the monks from their eternal torment, and survived the horrors of the crypt. But as they stood to leave, the ground beneath them shook once more, and the walls of the chamber began to crack. "We need to get out of here," Peter shouted, grabbing the book and helping Hargrove to his feet. "The whole place is coming down." With the tunnel collapsing behind them, the explorers fled the chamber, the ancient curse now broken, but the crypt still holding one final desperate attempt to claim them. They ran through the darkness, the walls closing in around them, the floor shifting under their feet. But with the curse lifted, the oppressive atmosphere of the crypt had faded, and the way forward was clear. They reached the entrance to the crypt just as the tunnel behind them collapsed completely, sealing the ancient horrors within. The first light of dawn was breaking through the cathedral's stained glass windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the now silent and empty crypt. The explorers emerged into the light, their faces pale, their bodies battered but alive. They had faced the darkness and won, but the experience had left its mark on each of them, a reminder of the ancient, malevolent forces that still lingered in the shadows of the world. As they stood in the ruined cathedral, catching their breath and feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces, Hargrove turned to the others. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "and let's make sure this place is never disturbed again." The sunlight filtering through the shattered stained glass windows provided a fleeting sense of comfort as the group emerged from the crypt, but it did little to erase the lingering dread. The cathedral was eerily silent, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The explorers moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls, eager to leave the cursed place behind. Hargrove led the way, the ancient book clutched tightly in his hands. He knew that their ordeal wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of ensuring that the crypt and the horrors it contained remained undisturbed. But for now, his priority was to get his team to safety. They crossed the nave, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadows that clung to the cathedral's corners. The oppressive darkness that had plagued them in the crypt seemed to follow them, a malevolent presence that refused to let go. Sarah walked close to Emily, her fingers brushing against the cool stone pillars as they moved. She could feel the weight of what they had just experienced pressing down on her. A heavy, suffocating burden that refused to lift. The memory of the skeletal monks and the cursed chalice was still fresh in her mind, and the terror of it all made her stomach churn. Peter, ever practical, glanced back toward the crypt's entrance, which now lay buried under tons of stone. "We've got to seal this place off," he muttered. "Make sure no one ever sets foot down there again." Jonathan nodded in agreement, though his face was pale, his hands still shaking from the ordeal. "I don't think I'll ever be able to look at another cathedral the same way again," he said, trying to inject some levity into his tone, but failing miserably. As they approached the heavy wooden doors that marked the exit, a low creak echoed through the cathedral. The sound stopped them in their tracks, their hearts skipping a beat. The creak grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of stone grinding against stone. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with dread. She clutched her camera tightly, as if it might somehow protect her from whatever was coming. "Stay close," Hargrove warned, his eyes scanning the darkened corners of the cathedral. "We're not out of here yet." The grinding sound continued, reverberating through the cathedral like the groan of some ancient, unseen beast. The explorers moved forward cautiously, their eyes wide with fear. The sound seemed to come from all around them, growing louder with each passing second. And then, from the shadows, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief disturbance in the darkness. But as they watched, the shadows coalesced, taking on a more solid form. A figure emerged, shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by the gloom. The air around it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the same dark force that had animated the monks in the crypt. "It can't be," Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. "We destroyed the chalice. We broke the curse." But the figure continued to move toward them, its steps slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, obscuring its face, its hands, its very form. Yet there was no mistaking the sense of evil that radiated from it, a cold, suffocating presence that filled the cathedral. "We need to move now," Hargrove ordered, his voice tight with fear. He pushed the heavy doors open, the daylight spilling into the cathedral, but even the light seemed powerless against the darkness that approached. The group bolted for the exit, but as they reached the threshold, the figure suddenly surged forward with impossible speed. Emily, who was closest to the door, felt an icy grip around her ankle. She screamed, stumbling forward, her hands flailing for something to hold on to. Peter reached out to grab her, but he was too late. The figure's shadowy hand yanked Emily back into the cathedral with a strength that defied reason. She fell hard to the stone floor, her camera skittering away, the lens shattering as it hit the ground. "Emily!" Sarah cried, rushing toward her friend, but Hargrove grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, we have to get out of here." Hargrove's voice was filled with desperation, but Sarah resisted, her eyes locked on Emily's struggling form. But the figure was too strong, too fast. It dragged Emily across the cold stone floor, her fingers scraping against the ground as she fought to break free. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her deeper into the cathedral's dark embrace. Jonathan tried to help, but the moment he stepped toward Emily, the shadows lashed out at him, forcing him back with a cold, malevolent force that made his skin crawl. "Help me!" Emily screamed, her voice filled with terror. She reached out toward the others, her eyes wide with desperation, but the shadows tightened their grip, pulling her closer to the figure. The explorers watched in horror, helpless to intervene, as the darkness enveloped Emily completely. Her screams were cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that echoed through the cathedral. The figure turned its hollow gaze toward the remaining explorers, its presence a chilling reminder of the power that still lurked within the ancient walls. Sarah collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the realization sank in. Emily was gone, taken by the same darkness they had fought so hard to escape. We have to go," Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Hargrove nodded, though his heart felt heavy with guilt and despair. He had led them into this nightmare, and now one of them was lost forever. But there was no time to mourn. If they stayed any longer, they would all suffer the same fate. "Move!" Hargrove shouted, pulling Sarah to her feet. They bolted for the door, the heavy wood creaking shut behind them as they burst into the daylight. The harsh sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the cathedral, but it was a welcome relief. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere within. The remaining explorers collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. For a moment, they simply sat there, too stunned to speak. The horror of what they had just witnessed was still sinking in, the loss of their friend a fresh wound that would take time to heal, if it ever did. But Hargrove knew that they couldn't stay there. The cathedral's darkness still loomed behind them, and the malevolent force that had taken Emily could easily reach out again. "We have to leave," Hargrove said, his voice hollow. "We need to get as far away from this place as possible." Sarah nodded numbly, her eyes vacant as she stared at the ground. Jonathan and Peter helped her to her feet, their faces pale and drawn. Together, the four survivors began the long, silent walk away from the cathedral, their minds haunted by the events that had transpired within its cursed walls. As they made their way down the overgrown path that led away from the cathedral, the sense of dread began to lift, the oppressive weight of the curse finally beginning to fade. But the loss of Emily hung over them like a dark cloud, a reminder of the terrible power they had encountered. Hargrove glanced back at the cathedral one last time, the ancient stone structure looming against the sky like a monument to forgotten horrors. He knew that the curse might be broken, but the darkness that had taken Emily was still out there, waiting in the shadows, ready to claim any who dared to disturb it. "We'll make sure no one ever comes here again," he vowed, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. The cathedral would stand as a silent testament to the horrors that had been unleashed, a place where the restless dead still lingered, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into their domain. The survivors continued their journey in silence, their thoughts consumed by the darkness they had left behind. They had escaped with their lives, but the price had been high, and the shadows of the cathedral would follow them for the rest of their days. And somewhere deep within the darkened halls of the ancient cathedral, the echoes of Emily's screams still lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that refused to die. The walk back to the village was a slow, grim affair, with each of the survivors lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the memory of Emily's final moments. The dense forest that surrounded the cathedral pressed in on them, the trees whispering in the wind as if sharing secrets of the ancient evil they had barely escaped. Sarah walked in a daze, her eyes fixed on the ground. Emily had been her closest friend, and the horror of seeing her dragged into the darkness was a wound that cut deep. Peter kept close to her, though he was at a loss for how to comfort her. He too was grappling with his own fears and guilt, the reality of what they had unleashed weighing heavily on him. Hargrove led the way, though his mind was elsewhere. The loss of Emily was a burden he couldn't shake, and the knowledge that he had been the one to lead them into this nightmare was a constant, gnawing pain. He kept the ancient book clutched tightly under his arm, its dark secrets a reminder of the price they had paid. He knew they had to leave the village immediately to distance themselves from the cathedral and its cursed legacy. But a part of him also feared what they had awakened, feared that the darkness would follow them, no matter how far they ran. Jonathan, the skeptic, walked in silence, his usual confidence shattered. The horrors they had witnessed had shaken him to his core, and he no longer knew what to believe. The world had suddenly become a far more dangerous and incomprehensible place, and the realization left him cold and empty. The village came into view just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The small, tight-knit community seemed almost untouched by time, its cobblestone streets and old stone cottages bathed in the soft golden light of the fading day. It was hard to believe that such evil could exist so close to this peaceful place. As they approached the village, the first sign that something was wrong became apparent. The streets were deserted. The usual bustle of villagers heading home or preparing for the evening noticeably absent. A thick, uneasy silence hung over the town, broken only by the distant tolling of the church bell, its sound mournful and slow. "What's going on?" Peter muttered, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "Where is everyone?" Hargrove frowned, a sense of foreboding settling over him. "This isn't right. The village. It feels different, like something's happened." Sarah looked around, her anxiety growing. "Maybe they're inside, hiding from whatever's out there." Jonathan shook his head. "No, it's too quiet. Something's off." As they entered the village square, the sense of wrongness only intensified. The few shops and homes that lined the square were dark, their doors closed and windows shuttered. The only movement came from the shadows that seemed to shift and swirl at the edges of their vision, creating the unsettling sensation that they were being watched. Then, out of the silence, the church bell rang again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. The sound sent a shiver down their spines, and they turned to face the source. The village church stood at the far end of the square, its steeple silhouetted against the darkening sky. The bell continued to toll, each chime reverberating through the empty streets like a death knell. "Why is the bell ringing?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with fear. "There's no service this late." "Maybe someone's inside," Peter suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "We need to check it out," Hargrove decided, his voice firm. "Something's happened here, and we need to find out what." Reluctantly, the others followed him across the square toward the church. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible through the opening. Hargrove pushed it open, and they stepped inside, the heavy wooden door creaking on its hinges. The interior of the church was dimly lit, the last rays of the setting sun casting long shadows across the pews. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that made their stomachs churn. At first, they saw nothing unusual. The church was empty, the pews undisturbed, the altar at the far end draped in a heavy velvet cloth. But as they moved further inside, the oppressive silence began to weigh on them, a tangible presence that filled the space with a sense of dread. And then they saw it, the procession. At the far end of the church, emerging from a doorway that led down to the crypt beneath, a line of figures appeared, moving in perfect unison. They were dressed in long hooded robes, their faces obscured by deep shadows. The procession moved slowly, deliberately, as if in a trance, each figure carrying a small, flickering candle that cast a pale light over their features. The explorers watched in horror as the procession continued to file into the church, their footsteps eerily silent on the stone floor. There was something deeply wrong about the figures, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "They look like the monks," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how is that possible?" Hargrove shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the procession. "It's not possible, unless—" He trailed off, the terrible realization dawning on him. The figures were not monks, they were the villagers. As the procession moved closer, the flickering candlelight revealed the truth. The robes were not those of the cursed monks, but the simple clothing of the villagers. The faces beneath the hoods were familiar, their expressions vacant and lifeless, as if all the warmth and humanity had been drained from them. "God, no," Jonathan breathed, his eyes wide with horror. They're all dead," Peter finished, his voice hollow. "They're all dead." The procession continued, moving past the explorers without so much as a glance in their direction. The villagers walked in a slow, steady line, their bodies swaying slightly with each step, as if pulled by some unseen force. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, backing away from the procession. "What's doing this to them?" Hargrove's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The curse, it wasn't just confined to the cathedral. When we disturbed the crypt, we must have unleashed something that spread to the village. "But we broke the curse," Peter protested. "We destroyed the chalice." "Maybe that wasn't enough," Hargrove replied, his voice filled with dread. "Maybe the darkness that was contained in the crypt found a new vessel. The villagers, they must have been corrupted, taken over by whatever evil was unleashed." The procession continued toward the altar, the villagers moving in perfect, eerie silence. At the front of the line, an older man who Hargrove recognized as the village priest, Father Reynolds, stepped up to the altar, his candle held high. The priest placed the candle on the altar, and as he did, The flames flickered and grew, casting an unnatural light over the church. The shadows danced and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. Then, in unison, the villagers turned to face the explorers, their eyes blank and lifeless, yet filled with an indescribable malice. The silence was broken by a low, guttural chant that echoed through the church, the sound rising and falling like the breath of some ancient slumbering beast. The explorers backed away, fear gripping their hearts as the villagers began to advance, their footsteps slow and deliberate. The chanting grew louder, the words incomprehensible but filled with a dark power that made the air around them vibrate with malevolence. "We have to get out of here," Hargrove shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the door. "Now!" The group bolted for the exit, but the villagers moved with surprising speed, their bodies unnaturally agile as they closed in. The explorers could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on them, the cold tendrils of evil wrapping around their hearts, squeezing the life out of them. As they reached the door, Jonathan stumbled, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell hard, his hands scraping against the rough floor. Peter and Hargrove turned back to help him, but the villagers were already upon them. The first villager, a middle-aged woman with a vacant stare, reached out and grabbed Jonathan by the arm. Her grip was like iron, her touch ice-cold. Jonathan struggled, but it was no use. The villagers closed in, their hands reaching for him, pulling him into their midst. "No!" Sarah screamed, but there was nothing she could do. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the sound filling the church with an unbearable pressure that made the walls seem to close in around them. Peter tried to pull Jonathan free, but the villagers were too strong. They dragged him back toward the altar, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Hargrove grabbed Peter's arm, his voice filled with urgency. "We have to go, Peter. We can't save him." "But," Peter began, but the look in Hargrove's eyes silenced him. Jonathan was lost, just like Emily, and if they didn't leave now, they would be too. With a heavy heart, Peter turned and fled with the others, the sound of Jonathan's screams echoing in his ears as they burst through the church doors and into the cold night air. The village square was still deserted, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant sound of the church bell tolling once more, a mournful dirge that seemed to signal the end of hope. Hargrove led the way, the book still clutched in his hand, as they ran through the empty streets, their footsteps pounding against the cobblestones. Behind them, the church bell continued to toll, the sound growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the cursed village. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, the dark trees looming like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. It was only then that they dared to look back, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The village lay in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering candles still held by the villagers inside the church. The bell had finally stopped ringing, leaving the night in an eerie, unsettling silence. "Jonathan," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with grief. She collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands as the reality of their situation sank in. Peter knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, though his own heart was heavy with sorrow. "We couldn't save him," he said quietly. "We couldn't save any of them." Hargrove stood silently, his eyes fixed on the distant church. The loss of Jonathan and Emily weighed heavily on him, but there was something else, an unsettling feeling that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "The procession," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a sign. The villagers weren't just corrupted. They were taken, claimed by the darkness that we unleashed. Peter looked up at him, his expression grim. "What do you mean?" Hargrove turned to face them, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding. "The darkness didn't just spread to the village. It's growing, consuming everything in its path. We might have stopped the monks, but we unleashed something far worse, and it's not going to stop." A cold wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the survivors. They were no longer just running from the horrors of the cathedral. They were running from something much larger, something that could not be contained. The darkness that had been unleashed was spreading, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything in its path. "We have to warn others," Hargrove said, his voice filled with urgency. "We have to make sure that no one else falls victim to this curse." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop something like this?" Hargrove didn't have an answer. He only knew that they had to try, that they had to do everything in their power to prevent the darkness from spreading any further. With one last look at the village, the survivors turned and made their way into the forest, the trees closing in around them as they began their journey away from the cursed place. The night was dark, the path ahead uncertain, but they knew they had to keep moving, to keep fighting against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. And as they disappeared into the shadows, the distant tolling of the church bell began again, a haunting reminder that the darkness was never far behind. The forest was a maze of twisted trees and tangled undergrowth, the night air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The remaining 3 survivors pushed through the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the ground. The oppressive silence of the village had given way to the eerie sounds of the forest at night, branches creaking in the wind, unseen creatures rustling in the underbrush. But beneath it all, there was something else. An unnatural stillness that seemed to follow them, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The darkness felt alive, as though it were a living, breathing entity that moved with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hargrove led the way, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The loss of Emily and Jonathan weighed heavily on him, but there was no time to grieve. Not yet. They had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the cursed village. But the darkness they had unleashed was relentless, and he knew it wouldn't be long before it found them again. "Do you think we're far enough away?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she stumbled over a root hidden in the darkness. She had been struggling to keep up, her exhaustion and fear evident in every step. Peter, who was walking close behind her, shook his head. "I don't think we can ever be far enough away," he muttered. "That thing, whatever it is, it's not going to stop until it has us all." Hargrove said nothing, but he knew Peter was right. The darkness they had unleashed wasn't just confined to the cathedral or the village. It was something far older, far more malevolent, and it was spreading. It had already claimed the villagers, turning them into lifeless husks, and it had taken Emily and Jonathan as well. Now it was coming for the rest of them. "We need to keep moving," Hargrove said finally, his voice tense. "If we can reach the next town, maybe we can find help, someone who knows how to stop this." "But who?" Sarah asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Who could possibly know how to fight something like this?" "I don't know," Hargrove admitted, his tone grim. "But we can't stay here. We're too exposed." As they continued deeper into the forest, the trees began to close in around them, their gnarled branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow them whole. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, curling around their legs like ghostly fingers. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The rustling of leaves, the creaking of branches, even the distant calls of nocturnal animals, all of it ceased, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. Hargrove stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah and Peter froze, their eyes wide with fear as they strained to listen. But there was nothing. Only the deafening silence that pressed in on them from all sides. And then, from the darkness, came the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs echoing through the trees. The footsteps were accompanied by a low, guttural moan, a sound that sent a chill down their spines. It was a sound they recognized all too well, the same unearthly wail they had heard in the crypt, the same sound that had heralded the arrival of the cursed monks. "They're here," Peter whispered, his voice filled with dread. "They've found us." Hargrove's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan, but there was no time. The footsteps were getting closer, the moaning growing louder, more insistent. The darkness around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the air growing colder with each passing second. "We need to hide," Hargrove said, his voice urgent. "Find cover and keep quiet." They scattered, each finding a spot to conceal themselves among the twisted roots and dense undergrowth. Hargrove crouched behind a large fallen tree, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could hear the footsteps drawing nearer, the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric. From his hiding place, Hargrove could just make out the figures moving through the trees, twisted, deformed shapes that bore only a vague resemblance to human beings. Their bodies were cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured, but there was no mistaking the dark energy that radiated from them. These were not the monks. They were something else, something far worse. The figures moved slowly, methodically, as if searching for something. The moaning had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to reverberate through the forest, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with each step, the fog swirling around their feet like a living thing. Hargrove watched in horror as one of the figures drew closer to his hiding place, its movement slow and deliberate. It paused, its head turning as if sniffing the air, and Hargrove felt his heart stop. The figure was almost upon him, its dark, hollow eyes scanning the underbrush as if sensing his presence. He held his breath, his body tensed, ready to bolt if the figure came any closer. But before it could find him, a sound from deeper in the forest caught its attention, a distant crash, followed by the sound of something large moving through the trees. The figure turned away, its attention drawn by the noise, and slowly began to move in the direction of the sound. Hargrove let out a silent breath of relief, his heart still pounding in his chest. But he knew they weren't safe. Not yet. The figures were still out there searching, and it was only a matter of time before they found what they were looking for. He carefully rose from his hiding place, scanning the area for any sign of Sarah or Peter. The fog had grown thicker, the darkness more oppressive, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. He had to find them before the figures returned, before the darkness closed in on them completely. Hargrove took a cautious step forward, his senses on high alert. The forest was eerily quiet once more, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves beneath his feet. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. He turned, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of Sarah, crouched low behind a fallen log, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah," Hargrove whispered, moving toward her as quietly as he could. "We have to find Peter. We need to get out of here." Sarah nodded, her face pale. She stood, her movements cautious, and together they began to search for Peter, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog that clung to the ground. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the fog grew denser, the air colder. The darkness around them seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides, making it difficult to see or hear anything beyond their immediate surroundings. "Peter," Hargrove called out in a low voice, his tone urgent. "Where are you?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. They moved faster now, their anxiety growing with each passing moment. The fog was so thick that it was almost like wading through water, each step feeling like an effort against the weight of the air around them. Suddenly, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft, muffled groan coming from somewhere ahead of them. It was a sound of pain, of someone struggling, and Hargrove's heart sank. "Peter," Sarah cried, breaking into a run. Hargrove followed close behind, the fog swirling around them as they moved. The groaning grew louder, more distinct, until they finally reached a small clearing, and there, at the center, they found Peter. He was on the ground, his back against a tree, his face twisted in pain. One of the dark figures stood over him, its shadowy form nearly indistinguishable from the fog that surrounded it. The figure's hand was on Peter's chest, its fingers sinking into his flesh as if drawing something out. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward. The figure turned, its hollow eyes fixing on her as she charged at it. But before she could reach Peter, the figure released him, its body dissolving into the fog as if it had never been there. Peter slumped to the ground, gasping for breath, his skin pale and clammy. Hargrove reached him first, dropping to his knees beside Peter's trembling form. "Peter, what happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Peter's eyes were unfocused, his breath shallow. It took something from me," he whispered, his voice weak. "I don't know what, but I can feel it. It's like a part of me is gone." Hargrove's heart sank. The dark figures weren't just hunting them. They were feeding on them, draining them of their life, their essence. Whatever they were not bound by the same rules as the monks in the crypt. These were spirits of a different kind, creatures of pure malevolence that had been unleashed by the breaking of the curse. "We need to get him out of here," Hargrove said, his voice firm. "We're not safe in the forest. We need to find shelter, somewhere we can regroup and figure out what to do next." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. Together, they helped Peter to his feet, his body weak and trembling. He could barely stand, his strength sapped by the encounter with the dark figure, but he knew he had to keep moving. As they stumbled through the forest, the darkness seemed to close in around them, the fog growing thicker with each passing moment. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant rustling of leaves, a reminder that the figures were still out there, hunting them. They moved as quickly as they could, but Peter was slowing them down, his steps faltering as his body struggled to keep up. Hargrove and Sarah supported him between them, but it was clear that they couldn't go on like this much longer. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing ahead.